Hello. This is going to be the fourth lecture on Kant. This is actually the second time I'm doing this. I did this yesterday, and it wouldn't upload for some reason. So this is our second run through. Second run through for me. Hopefully this one will work. We are behind schedule. Luckily, utilitarianism is a lot simpler than the ontology. So where we are at this point, and we're still working our way through the grounding for the metaphysics of morals. We started with the only good thing being the goodwill, because that is the thing that is good in itself. And then we went from there to duty. So duty is acting in accordance with the goodwill. But then we had this problem that we couldn't determine if we were acting from duty or acting according to our own inclinations. And then Kant solved that by giving us a universality, right? And then at that point, we had some examples. And then we got to the second part of the book where we learned what the one categorical imperative is, right? And that is that we should act always in accord with the maxim that we can will to be universalized. Okay, so we got there, and that was on page 30 of our book, or 421 in the page numbers in the margins. There is one categorical imperative, and that is this: act according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Okay, from here, we looked towards the development of the second principle, right? So universality is one principle. The second principle is going to be dignity, right? And we got this by analyzing the goodwill, right? And this was on page 35, margin page 427, right? So the will is thought of as the faculty of determining itself to action in accordance with the representation of certain laws, and such a faculty can be found only in rational beings, right? Now, what serves the will as an objective ground of its self-determination is an end, valid for all rational beings. On the other hand, what contains merely the ground of possibility on the action, whose effect is the end, is called the means. And why is he saying this? Why does he come to this? Well, because the goodwill is for itself, right? And the goodwill then must act in accordance with its own end, right? It's not subject to any other kind of end. And what does that mean? Well, that means that the good end, or the goodwill, has an absolute worth, right? Because it's not subordinated to anything, right? And so this goes to the creature, then the rational creature, the rational nature, is the nature that is the end in itself, right? And so this leads to the second principle, that rational nature exists as an end in itself. And then we have the practical imperative: act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end, and never simply as a means, right? And we got to this point at the end of the last lecture. He does have some examples here that they're the same ones that he considered earlier. I think we should at least look at the first one. And this is on page 36, and it's margin page 429. He says, first, as regards the concept of a necessary duty to oneself, the man who contemplates suicide will ask himself whether his action can be consistent with the idea of humanity as an end in itself. If he destroys himself in order to escape from a difficult situation, then he is making use of his person merely as a means, so as to maintain a tolerable condition till the end of his life. Man, however, is not a thing. and hence is not something to be used merely as a means. He must in all his actions always be regarded as an end in himself. Therefore I cannot dispose of man in my own person by mutilating, damaging, or killing him. Right? There's a more exact determination of this principle. A more exact determination of this principle, so as to avoid all misunderstanding. That is, regarding amputation of limbs in order to save oneself, or exposure of one's life to danger in order to save it, and so on, must be here omitted. Such questions belong to morals proper. Right. So, what does he do? He's showing how this principle acts just as the principle of the categorical imperative operates, right? That what we have here is a principle that allows us to reduce the moral calculation to something that is a priori, more akin to mathematics, so that we have certainty in our moral conclusions. Now, we want to go on to the next point. So please do read through all of the examples in detail there. These are on pages 36 and 37 of your book that show how this principle works. Okay. And then at the bottom of page 37 in our book, and so this is right around right around number 431 in the margin page numbers, he's going to start the new concept, the new thought. Right, and all of this is in section 2, and section 2 really is the most important part of this text, right? So let's take a look at this paragraph. It says, the principle of humanity in every rational nature, generally as an end in itself, is the supreme limiting condition of every man's freedom of action. Right? So this is what limits your freedom of action. Your freedom of action is limited by your needing to be an end in yourself as regards to your own person and in regards to another person. That's the limitation of freedom, right? Because that's where we start to get bound by the moral law. Okay? It says this principle is not borrowed from experience. This is an important point. It's not borrowed from an experience because it is known by and through reason itself. The things that we know from experience are not as reliable, right? Because the senses can be deceived. And when we know things only through experience, we're going to have disagreements about them. Right? So this is not known through experience. That's an important part of Kant. First, because of its universality, inasmuch as it applies to rational beings generally. So that's one point. And no experience is capable of determining anything about them. And secondly, because in experience, subjectively, humanity is not thought of as the end of men. That is, as an object that we ourselves actually make our end, which is as a law ought to constitute the supreme limiting condition of all subjective ends, whatever they may be, and hence this principle must arise from pure reason and not from experience. I do want to comment on his first reason there. How do we know that it is not part of experience? And that is because of its universality. And so oftentimes we think that we experience universals, but we don't. We only ever experience in the world our particular circumstances. This is made clear when you are confronted by children, right? So oftentimes you'll have a child who will be upset, and what will they say? This: you always make me clean my room, or you never let me do what I want, or you always make me go to bed early. And they think that they're experiencing these universals, but as soon as you are the adult that's interacting with them, you know that that's not true. It's not true that you always have to clean your room. There's all kinds of things that you do at other times. It's not the case that you never get to stay up early. There's several evenings a year that you stay up early. And this kind of illustrates it in a way, but we feel like we experience the universal, the always or the never, But when we really look at things more critically, what we realize is that we never experience the universal. We always only ever experience the particular. And so what the universal does is that it allows us to know that things that are universal are not from our direct experience. This is critical for Kant, and this is why universality is the first principle that he investigated. It was universality that got us to the categorical imperative, and then it's from that imperative that we were further able to get to the rational creature as an end in himself. And now we're going to take that a step farther. Okay, so let's keep going. So now we're on page 38. Which is in the margin numbers. We're still on 431 in the margin numbers. So let's say we'll continue, right? That is to say that the ground of all practical legislation lies objectively in the rule and in the form of universality, right? Because it's the law itself, which, according to the first principle, so that's the categorical imperative, makes the rule capable of being a law. Say, for example, a law of nature. Subjectively, however, the ground of all practical legislation lies in the end. But according to the second principle, right, that's the principle of the rational creature being an end in himself, the subject of all ends is every rational being as an end in himself. From this there now follows the third practical principle of the will as the supreme condition of the will's conformity with universal practical reason. Namely, the idea of the will of every rational being as a will that legislates universal law. Now, we're going to do an aside here before we kind of comment on this text. This is the third principle, so it's really important. But when I read it, right, if you read the text, it doesn't quite say what I said, right? If we read this text, it says, the supreme condition of the will's conformity with universal practical reason. Then there's this word viz, V-I-Z, period, comma, the idea of the will of every rational being. And it occurs to me that if you're not acquainted with reading a lot of philosophical texts or older books, you might not know what this word viz means. Well, this is an abbreviation of a Latin term, and it means namely. So when you're reading a book and you come across viz, V-I-Z, period, just put namely there, and then the text will make sense. There are some other Latin abbreviations that work their way in, right? The one that we're most familiar with is etc, or sometimes you'll see that ampersand C period. That's etc, right? That means and so forth. But we also have IE and we also have EG, and it's useful to talk about what those things mean. So IE means that is, and EG means for example. So when you see those things, just substitute the English terms that we know, and then we can go on reading and it makes more sense. So back to the text, right? The idea of the will of every rational being as a will that legislates universal law, right? And he says then, according to this principle, all maxims are rejected which are not consistent with the will's own legislation of a universal law. So this is the third principle, that the will is the legislator of the universal law. That means each one of us as rational creatures is the legislator. So it's probably useful to say a few words here about context, right? So we're Americans and we live in a democracy, and we think of legislators as people that we elect who go off and make the laws. And that's true. But legislator is a broader term than that. So Kant, right, he lived in the kingdom of Prussia, and they didn't have legislators that they elected that went off into an assembly and voted on laws. But that doesn't mean that they didn't have legislators. Legislator means lawgiver, and so the legislator in the kingdom of Prussia was the king. So Kant is asking not who is the legislator of the civil law, but who is the legislator of the moral law? And the legislator of the moral law, the person that makes the moral law, is each rational creature. So it's you and me and our neighbor, and probably also the angels, right? Because they are rational creatures along with us. So that is important, right? He says then, or he continues, thus, the will is thus not merely subject to the law, but is a subject to the law in such a way as that it must be regarded also as legislating for itself, and only on this account as being subject to the law, of which it can regard itself as the author. So the rational creature follows the law, is subject to the law that it legislates. The rational creature is subject to the law that it legislates. Okay, then down where it's right there, kind of where it says 432 in the margin, right? He continues, says, this is done in the present third formulation of the principle, namely, in the idea of the will of every rational being as a will that legislates universal law. So now we've got three principles, right? We've got the principle of universality, which is the categorical imperative, right? Then we've got the principle of dignity, which is the practical principle, right? The practical imperative, act always such that you treat humanity, whether in yourself or in the person of another, never as a means only, but also as an end in themselves, right? And now we've got the third principle. The third principle is that the idea of the will of every rational being as a will that legislates the universal law. These three are important, and they link up to Kant's three main concepts, or the concepts that came from him in the deontological tradition of universality, dignity, and autonomy. Right? There at the bottom of our page 38, still under the 432 in the margin number, says, thus the principle that every human will as a will that legislates universal law in all its maxims, provided it is otherwise correct, would be well suited to being a categorical imperative in the following respect. Just because of the idea of legislating universal law, such an imperative is not based on any interest, and therefore it alone of all possible imperatives can be unconditional. Or better still, the proposition being converted, if there is a categorical imperative, that is, a law for the will of every rational being, then it can only command that everything be done from the maxim of such a will as could at the same time have as its object only itself, regarded as legislating universal law. For only then are the practical principle and the imperative which the will obeys unconditional, inasmuch as the will can be based on no interest at all. So the three principles are all linked together. They all articulate the same kind of fundamental principles, and they follow from one another. Right? And then down on 433, on page, 433 is the margin number. On page 39, about halfway down, he articulates and links this principle up to the principle of autonomy. He says there, I want therefore to call my principle the principle of the autonomy of the will, in contrast with every other principle which I accordingly count under heteronomy. So heteronomy is when we're influenced by the world, and autonomy is when we're influenced, or our will is determined by our nature as rational creatures. There's this sense in Kant, and if you're picking this up, you're reading it the right way, that morality is inherently reasonable. And if we are reasonable, if we are rational and let our rationality determine our actions, then we will be morally praiseworthy creatures as we operate in the world. If, however, our rationality doesn't triumph, if we act in some way that is contradictory or at odds with our reason, then we will be morally blameworthy in our activities in the world. His whole point is to kind of transform moral thinking into much more of a science, in an a priori science at that. Right? Let's take a look at the next paragraph here. This is still on page 439 under the margin number 433. So the concept of every rational being as one who must regard himself as legislating universal law by all his will's maxims, so that he may judge himself in all his actions from this point of view, leads to another very fruitful concept which depends on the affirmation one, namely that of a kingdom of ends. So the moral world then is the kingdom of ends. It's where the legislator and the inhabitants of that are all ends in themselves, and that's why he has the kingdom of ends. Right? And he clarifies, this is at the bottom of that page, for all rational beings stand under the law, that each of them should treat himself and all others never merely as a means, but always at the same time as an end in himself. Hereby arises a systematic union of rational beings through common objective laws. That is, a kingdom may be called a kingdom of ends, and certainly only as an ideal, inasmuch as these laws have in view the very relation of such beings to one another as ends and means. The rational being belongs to the kingdom of ends as its member when he legislates in it universal laws, while also being himself subject to these laws. He belongs to it as sovereign when as legislator he is himself subject to the will of no other. Right? So this is where the autonomy comes from. When you are acting morally, you are not subject to another person. You are subject only to your own will. Now, of course, your will is the will of a rational creature, so it's going to be the same as the will of other rational creatures. But it's still yours. So you have complete autonomy of the will when you are acting morally. And when you are acting immorally, that's when you don't have autonomy. So when you act immorally, you don't have autonomy, you don't have dignity, you don't have equality. You have none of those things. It's only when you act morally that you have them. He draws the connection to dignity farther down that same page. This is on 434 in the margin notes, right above where it says 435. There's a short paragraph there on our page 40. It says, in the kingdom of ends, everything has either a price or a dignity. Whatever has price can be replaced by something else as its equivalent. On the other hand, whatever is above all price and therefore admits of no equivalent has dignity. And the thing that can admit of no equivalent is the thing that has absolute worth. And the thing that has absolute worth is the rational creature, the moral agent, the legislating being, right? This is where we're headed. All right. If we go over one more page, this is on their page, our page 41. And then in the margin note 436, way down at the bottom, he kind of summarizes everything that he said so far. He says, all maxims have, namely, 1, a form which consists in universality. 2, a matter, namely an end. And here the formula that says an irrational being, inasmuch as he is by his very nature an end, hence an end in himself, must serve in every maxim as a condition limiting all merely relative and arbitrary ends. So 1 and 2 and 3. a complete determination of all maxims by the formula that all maxims proceeding from his own legislation ought to harmonize with possible kingdom of ends as a kingdom of nature. There is a progression here through the categories of the unity of the form of the will, its universality, the plurality of its matter, its objects, that is, its ends, and the totality or completeness of its system of ends. Right? That's the legislation. But one does better if in moral judgment he follows the rigorous method and takes as his basis the universal formula of the categorical imperative. Right? So we can go the complicated way, or we can use the categorical imperative, which is thus: act according to that maxim which at the same time can make itself a universal law. There it is. And then after that, this is on the page 42 in our book, and then 437 and 438 in the margin notes, and then continuing on to the next page, he breaks down the principles again, and we're not going to get into that in this lecture, but do look at them. He's got a paragraph on the first principle, a paragraph on the second principle, and then over on page 43, he's got a long paragraph on the third principle. Right? And then on the following page 44 in our book, 440 in the margin note, he concludes this first section as: we have also shown above how neither fear nor inclination, but solely respect for the law is incentive which can give an action moral worth. So he's accomplished his task here, right? And then now that he's accomplished his task, he's going to flush out some of the other concepts that go with that, and that's what the rest of section 2 is. And it's enough, I think, just to kind of glance at the headings of those to see where he's going, right? Autonomy of the will is the supreme principle of morality. I think we know that, right? That's the kingdom of ends. Heteronomy of the will as the source of all spurious principles of morality. Right? When we're not acting as our own rational self-legislating beings, that's where we have the spurious principles of morality, when we're having to answer to someone else. Classification of all possible principles of morality founded upon the assumed fundamental concept of heteronomy. What is he doing here? He is criticizing the moral systems that came before him. And this largely is going to be those virtue ethics theories. Utilitarianism is going to come later. We're going to be discussing that this week. Okay. And that pretty much brings us to the end of the second section. The third section, we're not going to do a close reading of. It's relatively short. I'm going to tell you really kind of what that's about, so that you'll know. Read it, but I'll tell you what it's about, so maybe you can make some more sense of it. And what he's doing in the third section is he's really asking how all of this is metaphysically possible, because everything for Kant ultimately hinges on the possibility of freedom, right? Because the will, in order to be good, has to be autonomous, and therefore it has to be free. It can't be subject to or dependent upon another. That's what's really important here. And so he has to ask this question. The difficulty is one of the things that Kant is doing generally is he's responding to the philosophy of David Hume, who was a Scottish philosopher of the prior generation, the generation just before him. Hume is also considered an Enlightenment thinker, and Hume gives us a metaphysics. Well, gives us a physics, and insofar as he gives a metaphysics, the metaphysics that he gives is one that is very deterministic, right? It's one that's very much based upon the principle of causation, and how all effects in the world follow from a cause or a very specific chain of causes. And Kant sees this as a problem for the autonomy of the will, right? Because if all of our actions are determined how are we autonomous in the first place? And that's the question that this third section answers. And here's how he answers it. He answers it by getting into or approaching some of the work he did in his more metaphysical books. And that the book that's there's two metaphysical books by Kant that are really important. One is called the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics, and the other is called the Critique of Pure Reason. And here's what he does there. He says that there are two types of things in the world, right? There are the things in themselves, which he calls the noumena, and then there are the things as perceived by human beings, and that is the phenomena. And one of the things that Kant notices is that we don't know anything about the things in themselves. We only know things insofar as they're perceived by human beings. And we can get part of this, right? So if you ever have an opportunity, you might, look at pictures, and scientists sometimes will make like a mock-up of how bees see flowers, and you can see that they see them differently than us. But even when we look at the pictures of how a bee sees a flower and we see that it sees the flower differently than us, we're still not seeing it like the bee does, because our eyes don't actually see the same colors that bees see. They see ultraviolet light, and we have no idea what that looks like to them. But Kant says that everything is like this. He says that everything is like this, that all of the things themselves in the world come to us filtered through human perception and the human mind, and there are categories in the mind and the perception, he calls them schema, that determine what the phenomena are. And we don't know that those qualities and characteristics are present in the things themselves. And so two of those categories of the mind are space and time. And the mind uses space and time to come up with what he calls the synthetic a priori intuition of causation. So causation for Kant is a type of intuition. But the concept that we are free in our choices is another type of intuition. And Kant says that this distinction between the phenomena and the noumena could be how the categorical imperative is possible. That it might not be possible as we understand the phenomena of ourselves, but it very well could be a characteristic quality of ourselves as a noumenon. And that's kind of where he ends this book. And I think this is really close to where we're going to end the lecture. I am very, very hopeful that this lecture will upload and that you will be able to see this. This does put us behind, and I do apologize about that. We are behind because this is Sunday, the 19th of June, and today we were supposed to be starting our unit on utilitarianism, and I'm really worried that we're not going to get to some of that until later in this week. So I do apologize for the technical difficulties that I had yesterday. Let us hope that we do not continue to have some of those same difficulties as we go into the coming week.